Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started with a simple question, one that seemed so innocent at the time, but in retrospect, it should have been a warning. Did you hear that? I had just come home from a long day at work, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening. My niece had visited earlier in the week, and she'd left her doll behind in the living room. The same doll she loved to carry with her everywhere, a little porcelain figure with rosy cheeks and a painted smile. I hadn't thought much about it. After all, it was just a doll. But that night, everything changed. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I first heard it. A faint sound, like something scraping against the floor. I looked around, my eyes scanning the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The house was as it always was, quiet and still. The sound came again, this time louder. I froze. It was coming from the living room, just beyond the hallway. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. It was unmistakable now, something was moving. I got up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped carefully into the living room. There, sitting on the floor where my niece had left it, was the doll. But something was wrong. It was no longer where I had last seen it. The doll had shifted slightly, now sitting a little closer to the edge of the rug. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of the oddity. My first thought was that it had somehow fallen, but the angle at which it sat made that impossible. And then I noticed it. Its face, there was something different about its smile. It was wider now, more exaggerated. The kind of smile you see on someone trying to hide something sinister behind their teeth. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I had to be tired. I couldn't let my mind play tricks on me. But then I heard it again. A soft scraping sound, this time followed by a faint, almost inaudible giggle. My blood ran cold. I turned quickly, but the living room was empty. No one was there. Just the doll. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air around me felt heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in. The sound, the movement, it couldn't be real. And yet, it was. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet were frozen to the floor. I glanced back at the doll. And that was when I saw it. Its eyes. They were no longer just painted dots. They were watching me. I blinked, but they didn't move. Or did they? The longer I stared at them, the more I felt like they were alive, that they were looking at me. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and I snapped out of my trance. I stepped backward, my heart racing. I needed to leave, to get out of the house, but something held me there. The doll's smile widened. And then, I heard a voice. It was quiet, like a whisper, but unmistakable. A child's voice, sweet and innocent, yet tinged with something else. Something dark. You left me behind. I spun around, but there was no one. Just the doll. And it was smiling. I stood frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. You left me behind. The words echoed in my mind, though the voice was gone now, like a distant memory fading into the darkness. For a moment, The room was completely silent again, but it was a heavy silence, thick with tension, like the house itself was holding its breath. The doll, still sitting there, appeared unchanged. But I knew better than to trust my eyes. There was something in the air, something wrong. I looked around, hoping to find some explanation, some logical reason for what I was feeling, but the room felt alien, distorted. The walls seemed to stretch farther away than I remembered, and the shadows in the corners were deeper, darker. I couldn't tell if the evening light had simply faded or if something more sinister was at play. I took a slow step back toward the hallway, but my feet felt as though they were sinking into the carpet. Each movement was heavy, labored. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The doll. It wasn't just a doll anymore. It was alive. I could feel it watching me, its porcelain eyes following every hesitant movement, even as I turned away to escape. I took another step, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps, quick and light, like a child running across the floor. But no child was there. My pulse quickened as I whirled back toward the doll, panic starting to bubble up from deep inside me. But it was still there, sitting quietly on the rug, its smile wider than before. Had it moved? I couldn't be sure, but I could feel it. The weight of its presence. It wasn't the doll anymore, it was something else, something, waiting. I knew I had to leave, to get away from it, but the door was so far away now. It was as if the house had grown larger in the moments I had stood there, watching the doll. My legs felt weak, and the air around me grew colder with every passing second. A cold that seeped into my bones, like a frozen wind that came from nowhere. I forced myself to move, inching backward, until I stumbled over the edge of the rug. The sound of my feet catching on the fabric echoed through the room, sharp and jarring. And then, as if to punish me for the noise, I heard it again. The soft scrape of porcelain against the floor. But this time, it was closer. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but the doll hadn't moved. Not in the way I had expected. It was still sitting, but now it was closer to the edge of the rug, its porcelain fingers curled slightly, as if it had shifted its position just enough to make me doubt what I had seen before. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and turned toward the hallway once more. The door. If I could just get to the door. But as my hand reached out to grip the doorknob, the house seemed to groan, as if the walls themselves were alive. The noise was unnatural. It felt like something pressing against the very structure of the house, as if something was trying to break through. I froze again, my hand still on the doorknob, my heart racing. The house was changing. Then came the whisper. This time, it was louder, sharper, more insistent. You can't leave me. I jerked away from the door, spinning around to face the doll. But it wasn't just the doll anymore. There was something else in the room now. A figure, barely visible at first, standing in the corner. Tall, thin, and out of place. Its shape was almost human, but the details were wrong. A silhouette, shrouded in shadow, its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, moving unnaturally fast, like it was gliding through the air, not walking. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Just like that. I was left standing there, alone again. The doll was still there, sitting on the rug, but now its smile was stretched impossibly wide. The eyes, now more pronounced, gleamed with a malicious light. It felt like the room itself was closing in on me, the walls pressing against me, the air thick and heavy. I could still hear the footsteps. Light, hurried, almost like a child running, or perhaps something far worse. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the house was no longer a home. It was a maze, a prison, and I was its prisoner. The whisper echoed in my head again. You left me behind. And this time, I was sure. It wasn't just a voice. It was a promise. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were choking the life out of me. My heart was hammering against my chest, each beat more frantic than the last. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely keep them on the doorknob. I had to leave. I had to leave. But my feet were stuck to the floor, as if the very ground beneath me was holding me in place. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. You left me behind. It was no longer a soft murmur, but a rasping voice, as though it came from deep within the house itself, like it was woven into the very fabric of the walls. I tried to shake my head, to clear the fog of fear clouding my mind, but I couldn't. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. The doll was still there, smiling its grotesque smile, but its eyes, they weren't just looking at me anymore. They were staring, unblinking, unrelenting. I could feel their cold, lifeless gaze pressing into me, like they were reading my every thought, like they knew my deepest fears. I turned away, forcing myself to take a step back. The hallway stretched out before me, an endless corridor of shadows, but it was still too far. I could feel the oppressive weight of the house closing in on me, like the very walls were leaning in, ready to swallow me whole. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint shuffle, the sound of something dragging across the floor. I froze, my blood running cold. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see what I knew was there, but my body moved on its own. The doll was gone. The space it had occupied on the rug was empty. But I didn't dare turn around fully. I couldn't. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. A pulse of panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. Not yet. Then came a creak, so faint I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. It came from behind me, from the far end of the hallway. Slowly, I turned my head, my body shaking uncontrollably. At the far end of the hallway, the doll was standing. But it wasn't just standing. It was moving. The porcelain figure was swaying, its legs shaking slightly, as though it were testing its new ability to stand. Its head tilted, the smile still plastered across its face, but now it was wider, stretching so unnaturally that the doll's painted face seemed to crack. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The doll was alive, and it was coming toward me. It moved in slow, jerking motions, like a marionette whose strings had been pulled too tight. The scraping sound of porcelain against wood filled the air, making my teeth ache. Every step the doll took seemed to bring it closer, until I could hear the soft clicking of its joints, its tiny feet dragging across the floor. The closer it got, the more I could see the details. Its hands were unnaturally stiff, as if frozen in place, but they were reaching out toward me. Its smile, still grotesque, stretched impossibly wide, showing too many teeth. The eyes, now gleaming with something unnatural, were wide open, watching me. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I couldn't move. You left me behind, the voice whispered again, but now it was closer. Too close. The doll's tiny, cracked lips barely moved, but I could hear the words with terrifying clarity. The air around me felt suffocating, thick with dread. It was here now, inches away from me. I could feel its cold, lifeless presence in the air, the weight of its stare pressing down on me. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded from behind me. I jumped, spinning around, my heart leaping into my throat. But the hallway was empty. Nothing. Nothing except the heavy silence that wrapped itself around me, crushing me. But when I turned back, the doll was gone. For a split second, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I was just losing my mind. Maybe the exhaustion of the week had finally gotten to me. But then I heard it. A faint giggle. A child's giggle. It was followed by the soft patter of footsteps running down the hallway, but there was no child to be seen. I turned toward the sound, my body trembling uncontrollably, but it was like the sound was coming from every direction at once. The walls themselves seemed to be alive with the noise. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. You left me behind. The whisper was louder now, clearer. But it wasn't just one voice. It was two, three. A chorus of whispers, all coming from the dark corners of the house, echoing in the hollow space. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my vision swimming with fear. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the hallway seemed to stretch further and further, the exit impossibly distant. The doors, the windows, everything was locked, sealed shut. And then I heard it. The sound of tiny feet padding toward me, faster now, almost running. I turned around, desperate to escape, but there, standing at the end of the hallway, was the doll. And this time, its smile wasn't just wide. It was malicious. It took one slow, deliberate step toward me, its tiny hands stretched out, its painted eyes glowing in the dim light. I had no choice but to run. I ran. My feet barely touched the floor as I sprinted down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty house. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, each inhale feeling like it might be my last. I couldn't think straight. My mind was a blur, filled with the image of that doll, its smile so wide, its eyes so alive. I could hear it behind me, the soft patter of tiny feet on the floor, growing louder with every passing second. The house was no longer the place I had once called home. It was a labyrinth, twisting and shifting, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the doll at my heels, but it was still far behind. For now. I turned a corner, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to escape, but the hallway stretched endlessly before me. It was as if I had run in a straight line only to end up where I had started. No matter which way I turned, I couldn't find the exit. I stumbled, disoriented, and almost tripped over my own feet. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like the house itself was alive and closing in on me, trapping me in its web. I couldn't hear the doll anymore. For a moment, it seemed like the house had swallowed the sound of its footsteps. But I knew it was still there, somewhere, watching, waiting. The silence was deafening. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to calm down. I had to think. But my mind refused to cooperate. The words echoed in my head again, over and over. You left me behind. The voice. The doll. It was all becoming too much. I glanced down the hallway, my eyes darting around, searching for something, anything, that might help me escape. The darkness seemed to deepen with every passing second, the shadows twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl. The house, it was changing. It wasn't just the doll anymore. The house itself had become a part of the nightmare. A creak sounded from behind me. The unmistakable sound of something or someone moving. I whirled around, my pulse racing, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. But then, I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow stretched across the wall, slowly growing larger. It moved, as though something were approaching, but it wasn't the doll this time. No, it was something far worse. The shape was tall, hunched, and seemed to move with an unnatural, jerking motion. It wasn't human. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Its limbs were too long, too thin, bending at angles. The head was too large, with hollow, empty eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Its mouth hung open, a jagged line of blackness that stretched wide, as though it were smiling, a smile that rivaled the doll's in its grotesque, twisted shape. I took a step back, my feet sliding against the floor, my entire body frozen in terror. This thing, this creature, was not from this world. I could feel it in my bones, the wrongness of it. The air around it seemed to pulse with a dark, unnatural energy, making it harder to breathe. It took another step forward. Shoo! The sound was barely audible, but I heard it. A low, gurgling sound, like something wet being dragged across the floor. The creature's head tilted slightly, its eyes locking onto me. It was watching me. It was hunting me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face that thing. I turned and ran again, my feet moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't know where I was going. There was no plan, no route in mind. I just had to get away. I had to escape. I reached the stairs and nearly threw myself down them, the wooden steps creaking under my weight as I flew down. The house seemed to groan with every step I took, as though it were alive, resenting my attempts to leave. But just as I reached the bottom, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, the sound cutting through the silence of the house, but there was no one there to hear it. I kicked and twisted, trying to break free, but whatever had hold of me was strong, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. It dragged me back toward the stairs, the cold, skeletal grip tightening with every passing second. I looked down. It was the doll. The porcelain figure was crawling up the stairs after me, its tiny, stiff arms reaching out, pulling itself forward with unnerving speed. Its smile was stretched so wide now that it looked as though its face might split in two. The eyes glowed, gleaming in the dark like two hollow voids. "You left me behind," the voice hissed again, but it was no longer the voice of a child. It was deeper now, distorted, as though many voices were speaking at once, layered on top of one another. The doll was climbing the stairs toward me. I kicked harder, my mind going numb with panic. With every movement, I felt the grip loosening. I had to get up, had to escape, before it was too late. I threw myself forward, scrambling to my feet, but just as I did, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The creature. The tall, hunched figure. It was standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching me. Its twisted smile spread wider. And then it spoke, its voice deep and guttural, filling the space around me. "You can't leave." I knew then. The house wasn't going to let me go. Not now. Not ever. I had never felt fear like this. It was a raw, primal thing, gnawing at my insides, twisting my stomach into knots. The air felt colder now, the darkness heavier. The house had become a living nightmare, its walls shifting and breathing around me, swallowing me whole with every step I took. The creature at the bottom of the stairs stood motionless, but I knew it wasn't done. It was waiting for me to make my move, to give it an opening. I had no plan, no strategy. There was nothing left but instinct. Without thinking, I turned and bolted down the hallway, my legs screaming from the effort, but the weight of the air of the house was pulling me back. I could hear them following me, the whispers growing louder, the sound of tiny feet scuttling behind me, like something was chasing me through the dark. I dared not look back, afraid of what I might see, afraid that if I did, I would freeze in terror and never move again. But even though I couldn't look, I could feel it. The presence. That thing. The creature. It was still there, somewhere, watching me, its eyes never leaving my back. The air felt thicker, oppressive, as if the house itself was trying to suffocate me, to trap me inside its dark, rotting walls. I stumbled into the living room, my breath ragged and shallow, my pulse racing in my ears. The space felt wrong. The shadows were longer, deeper, and the once familiar furniture now seemed to loom like silent sentinels waiting for me to make a mistake. My mind was fractured, disconnected. I could no longer tell what was real and what was the result of the terror running through my veins. Then I saw it. The doll. It was sitting on the couch, its small, porcelain form somehow more menacing than ever. But it wasn't just sitting. It was looking at me. The smile that twisted across its face was wider, more jagged. It was too perfect. Too still. The eyes glowed faintly, like two burning coals in the darkness, watching my every move. I froze. I couldn't tear my gaze away from it, even though every cell in my body screamed at me to turn and run. The longer I looked, the more I could feel the pull, like the doll was reaching out to me, beckoning me toward it with invisible strings. I took a slow step back, my mind racing. It was all I could do not to scream. The voices grew louder now, more frantic, as if they were coming from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the ceiling. They were everywhere. And then I heard something worse than the whispers. A crack. A sound like porcelain breaking, like something sharp snapping, and then a low groan from behind me. I spun around, too late. The creature was right there, towering over me, its head dipping down slowly, its eyes gleaming with a terrifying hunger. It wasn't just a man anymore. It wasn't just something pretending to be human. It was wrong. Every part of it was wrong. Its arms were impossibly long, bent at sharp angles, as if they had been twisted by some force I couldn't understand. Its body was impossibly thin, but its chest seemed to rise and fall in an unnatural rhythm, as though something inside it was alive, something that didn't belong. The mouth, still open wide, stretched far beyond what should have been possible, as though its jaw had unhinged. I could see teeth. Hundreds of them, sharp and jagged, glistening in the dim light. But it didn't move. Not yet. It just stared. A pulse of dread shot through me. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. It wasn't just a creature anymore, it was a nightmare. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, scrambling backward on my hands, my nails scraping against the wooden floorboards. The room felt like it was closing in. The walls seemed to bend, warping around me as the house itself shifted. I could feel the temperature drop, the cold creeping into my bones, freezing the air in my lungs. I turned back to the doll, and for the first time, I saw it move. The doll's eyes blinked. I couldn't breathe. My mind scrambled to process this sight, but it was impossible. The doll couldn't, no, it shouldn't move. It was a toy. a thing made of porcelain and paint. But it did. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it turned its head toward me, its smile widening, stretching impossibly wide. The grin on its face now twisted into something far more sinister, a grin that seemed to mock my fear, my helplessness. The voice echoed again, that same distorted whisper. You left me behind. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls were closing in, the house was suffocating me, and the creature was still there, waiting. The doll's eyes never left me, its smile never faded, as it began to crawl, slowly, with an eerie, jerky movement, toward me. I didn't know how much more I could take. The house, the doll, the creature, it was all a trap. There was no escape. The last of my sanity was slipping away, and all I could do was scream. But as I opened my mouth, the scream never came. Instead, the sound that emerged was soft, faint, as though the house itself had swallowed my voice. And then, everything went black. I closed the door behind me and sighed. The day had been long, exhausting. All I wanted was to throw my bag on the floor, collapse onto the couch, and let the silence of my apartment swallow me whole. But something was off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The air smelled the same, the furniture stood in its usual places. Yet, a strange unease crawled up my spine, whispering that something had shifted. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of this feeling. And then I saw it. Everything in the apartment was reversed. The couch was still against the far wall, but now it was on the wrong side. The bookshelf, usually to the left of the television, was now to the right. Even the paintings, the clock, the scratches on the wooden floor, every single detail was flipped, like I had stepped into a mirrored version of my own home. My stomach twisted. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the doorknob. But before I could grip it, the door slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed through the room, heavy and final. I grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. Locked. My heart thumped against my ribs. I tried to rationalize, maybe a draft. Maybe the hinges were misaligned. Maybe. Then the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, something had changed. A chair near the dining table had moved. Just an inch. But it had moved. I wasn't alone. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. The chair, no, it couldn't have moved. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe the flickering light played tricks on my eyes. But the air in the room had changed. It felt denser, charged. Like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure shifts and you can almost hear the sky hold its breath. I reached into my pocket for my phone, my fingers fumbling against the fabric. A sharp chill ran down my spine when I pulled it out. The screen was blank. Dead. I pressed the power button, nothing. A cold sweat formed on my forehead. My phone had been charged before I left work. Even if it had shut down, it should have at least vibrated when I tried to turn it on. Something was wrong. I turned toward the window, hoping to see the familiar cityscape outside, to ground myself in reality. But when I pulled back the curtain, my breath hitched. There was nothing. Just an endless expanse of darkness. No streetlights, no buildings, no stars. Just a vast, silent void stretching infinitely in every direction. My fingers trembled as I reached toward the glass. The surface felt colder than usual, almost like ice. I pressed against it gently, and then the reflection moved. Not mine. Not exactly. The person in the glass was me, but his movements were slightly delayed, off by just a fraction of a second. I raised my right hand. My reflection raised his left. A mirror image. A perfectly mirrored world. I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling for explanations, for logic, for anything that made sense. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I was dreaming. But no dream had ever felt this real. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around. The chair was closer. Much closer. It was now inches away from where I stood. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Distant. My name. Spoken in my own voice. The whisper froze me in place. It wasn't just my name, it was my voice. Like an echo traveling through thick air, warped, stretched. I turned my head slowly, my body stiff with fear. The chair hadn't moved again, but I felt it, that something else had. The reflection in the window. It was still there, standing in the glass, mirroring me. But now, its head was slightly tilted, its lips parted as if it had just spoken. I took a shaky step forward. My reflection did the same. I raised my hand again, this time, so did he, perfectly synchronized. No delay. But his fingers curled differently, hesitating midway. That wasn't right. A surge of panic shot through me, tightening my chest. I forced a breath, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. I turned toward the door, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the empty apartment. My fingers wrapped around the doorknob, cold and smooth against my skin. Locked. I twisted harder. It didn't budge. A deep sense of unease gnawed at my stomach. I hadn't locked it when I came in. I never locked it. A faint tap. I spun around. The chair. It was closer. Again. The whisper came back, but this time it wasn't from the window. It was behind me. Right behind me. I lunged for the light switch, fingers slamming against it. The room flickered. For just a second, everything went black. And in that split second of darkness, I saw something move. Not the chair. Something else. The lights hummed back to life, casting weak yellow beams across the room. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling. Everything looked the same. The chair. The table. The reflection in the window, still watching. But the air was heavier now, like the walls themselves were leaning in. And then I saw it. On the floor, near the chair. A faint, wet footprint. Not mine. I stared at the footprint. My breath caught in my throat. It was small, bare, and wet, as if someone had just stepped out of a puddle. But my floor was dry. There was no water. I took a step back, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like unseen hands. I glanced toward the window, expecting my reflection to be there, mimicking me as always. But it wasn't. The glass was empty. No reflection. Just the room. The chair. The dim light. The door that wouldn't open. And the faint outline of another footprint, closer this time. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into fists. This isn't real. It can't be real. And then, a sound. soft, wet, bare skin meeting the floor, one slow step at a time. Behind me. I turned, my whole body rigid, but there was nothing there. Just my apartment, quiet and still. But something was different. The chair. It was facing me now. I felt a cold shiver climb my spine. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. My own mind scrambled for logic, for reason. Maybe I moved it. Maybe I forgot. But then, I saw it. A shape. A faint outline of something sitting in the chair. Not solid. Not entirely visible. Like a smudge on reality, barely there. And it was watching me. The light above flickered, humming like a dying insect. I took a step back, my hands reaching for anything to ground me. My fingers brushed against the edge of the table. Solid. Real. But the air was getting colder. Then came the whisper. Not from behind me. Not from the chair. From inside the room. All around me. You don't belong here. The words slid into my ears like ice water, sending a deep, instinctive terror through my bones. I pressed my hands against my temples, squeezing my eyes shut. No. No. This isn't happening. I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the door. My fingers found the knob again, twisting, pulling, slamming against it. Still locked. A gust of air brushed against my neck. Not wind. Breath. I spun around. The chair was empty. But the footprints, they were everywhere now. Leading from the chair, stretching across the floor. And then, one appeared. Right in front of me. Not gradually. Not fading in. It was just suddenly there. A wet imprint on the wood, inches from my foot. And then, another. And another. Each one closer. I felt the air shift, the presence pressing against me, unseen but undeniable. I wasn't alone. And whatever was here, it was getting closer. The footprint in front of me was still wet, the glistening outline of a bare foot sinking into the wooden floor. My breath came in short gasps as I took a slow, careful step backward. The air was thick, pressing in on me from all sides, carrying a strange dampness, a smell like stagnant water, like something left too long in the dark. And then, another step. Not mine. The sound was soft but deliberate. The wet slap of skin against the floor. I froze. It was right in front of me. I could feel it. Something unseen, something heavy, something that had been watching me this whole time. The silence deepened. Then, a whisper. Not words. Not a voice. Just a sound, like air being pulled through teeth. A presence loomed over me, too close, too real. The room felt like it was folding inward, trapping me, pressing me into itself. My pulse pounded in my ears. My fingers trembled as I reached behind me, searching for the door, for anything. My hand touched something. Not the door. Something cold. Something soft. Something that moved. A scream caught in my throat as I jerked my hand back, stumbling away. My shoulders slammed into the wall, but I barely felt it. My mind was screaming, run, run, run. The lights flickered, buzzing like dying insects. And then, in the brief flash of brightness, I saw it. A shape. Standing right in front of me. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. It was me, but not me. My face, but wrong. My features were there, but off, the eyes too hollow, the mouth too still, the skin too smooth, like it wasn't real. Like it was trying to be me, but didn't know how. It didn't move. Neither did I. I couldn't. Then it smiled. Not a natural smile. Not something a human should be able to do. The lips pulled back too far, stretching the skin, revealing too many teeth. And then it took a step forward. The footprints were mine. It was me. And it was coming closer. My body finally reacted. I spun, slamming both hands against the door, twisting the knobs so hard my fingers ached. It turned. Unlocked. I fell through the doorway, barely catching myself before I hit the ground. My breath was ragged, my limbs shaking as I scrambled backward, expecting to see it. But the room was empty. No footprints. No chair. No reflection. Just my apartment. Silent. Still. But I knew. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Have you ever spoken to someone who doesn't exist? I didn't expect an answer. The question just slipped out, lingering in the quiet, empty apartment. My eyes wandered around, scanning the room I had known so well. The scent of old wood and stale air filled the space, a reminder of how long I'd been here, alone. Or was I? I moved toward the window, pulling the blinds open just a fraction to peek at the street below. The familiar sounds of the city echoed up, the honking of cars, the murmurs of pedestrians, but there was something about it today that felt off. My mind wasn't quite right. It had started with her. Diana. My neighbor. She had been there for as long as I could remember. Always with that same smile, that same warmth. She'd greet me in the hallway, ask how my day was, talk about the weather, small things. But there was something unsettling about her. She was always there, but never really present. I had never given it much thought until now. Until the question popped into my head. How long had I lived here? Was she always around? I tried to recall how long she had been in that apartment next door. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but I was sure she had always been there. That's when I went to the concierge. Diana? I asked, casual enough. She lives next door, right? The old man looked up from his desk, his face expressionless. There's no one by that name in that apartment, he said, his voice flat, as if he'd said the same thing 100 times. No one's lived there in over 10 years. I felt the blood drain from my face. What did he mean, no one? I had spoken to her just this morning. I had seen her, talked to her. She was standing by the elevator, smiling, as usual. I had smiled back, asked how she was doing, just a casual exchange. But the concierge was certain. Are you sure? I asked, my voice trembling a little. Yes, he replied simply, going back to whatever he had been doing. No one's lived in that apartment for over a decade. I stood there for a moment, processing what he had said. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I returned to my apartment, each step feeling heavier. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I leaned against it for a moment, trying to ground myself. Trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I had misheard the concierge. Maybe Diana was just a figment of my imagination, some kind of odd dream. But then, I remembered her laugh. The way she tilted her head when she asked me if I wanted to grab coffee. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It was just a coincidence. I was overthinking things. But as I walked through the apartment, my gaze fell on the hallway mirror and my reflection seemed wrong. I blinked. No, it was just the angle. But when I looked again, I saw something else. A shape in the reflection. It wasn't mine. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Nothing. I stood still, breath caught in my throat. Something wasn't right. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was closing in on me. I turned back to the mirror and caught the faintest movement, just a shadow shifting. But there was nothing behind me. Nothing at all. My heart raced. I stumbled away from the mirror, back toward the kitchen. I needed something to ground me, something real. I grabbed a glass, my hand shaking as I filled it with water. But the sound of running water only added to the suffocating silence of the apartment. And then, a knock. Soft at first. Almost hesitant. It came from the door. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Another knock. It was Diana. I could feel it. I knew it was her. I moved to the door, my heart pounding. But before I could reach the handle, something in the hallway caught my eye. There, in the reflection of the mirror, was a figure. It was standing still, facing me. It looked just like Diana. But it couldn't be her. Could it? I opened the door slowly, my breath catching in my chest. But there was no one there. Just the empty, quiet hallway. Nothing. The door slammed shut behind me. And I realized then there was no one living next door. Not now, not ever. And yet, somehow, she had been there. Right there. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I really did. I turned off the lights, crawled under the covers, and shut my eyes. But the second I did, my mind filled with images of Diana. Her smile. The way she tilted her head when she spoke. The way she had stood in the mirror, motionless, watching me. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I lay there in the darkness, listening. The apartment had never felt this silent before. Usually, there was some kind of background noise, the hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the pipes, but now, it felt like the silence itself was pressing down on me, suffocating. Then I heard it. A faint shuffle. Not inside my apartment, outside. Right behind my door. I held my breath, straining my ears. Another sound. A soft, deliberate knock. Not loud. Not urgent. Just patient. Knock. 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 I didn't move. A part of me wanted to open the door. To rip it open and prove to myself that there was nothing there. That it was just my imagination. But another part of me, some deep, instinctual part, knew better. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. The knocking stopped. And then, a whisper. Faint. Almost too quiet to hear. But I could make out the words. You shouldn't have asked about me. A chill ran down my spine. I sat up, my hands gripping the sheets. The whisper had been right outside my door. I waited, my heart hammering, but there was nothing else. Just silence. I forced myself to move, slowly sliding out of bed. My feet touched the cold floor, and I hesitated before stepping forward. I needed to check. Needed to know if someone was actually there. Each step felt heavier than the last as I made my way to the door. My fingers hovered over the lock. I held my breath, then slowly, carefully, turned the handle. The door creaked open an inch, then another. The hallway was empty. But something was wrong. The air felt different. The dim lighting of the corridor flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The air smelled stale, like dust and something faintly rotten. And then I saw it. A small object on the floor right in front of my door. I crouched down, my hand shaking as I reached for it. It was a photograph. Old, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been sitting somewhere forgotten for years. I turned it over. It was a picture of my apartment building, taken from the street. The image was grainy, but I could make out the front entrance, the windows, the balconies. And then I noticed something. In one of the windows, my window, stood a figure. Diana. She was staring directly into the camera. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. She wasn't inside my apartment. She was outside, standing on the balcony railing, as if she had climbed up there. As if she had been waiting for someone to notice. A cold dread settled into my bones. I snapped my head up, eyes darting to my own window. The curtains were drawn. I couldn't see outside, but the urge to look was overwhelming. I moved toward the window, each step slow and hesitant. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I pulled it back, and my breath caught in my throat. Outside, on my balcony, stood a figure. Not moving, not blinking, just staring at me through the glass. It was her, Diana. But her face was all wrong. It was stretched, distorted, like something was wearing her skin but didn't know how to make it fit. And then, she smiled. The same familiar smile. But now, it felt completely alien. My body reacted before my mind did. I stumbled back, crashing into the table, knocking over a lamp. The room was plunged into darkness. I scrambled for the light switch, my fingers fumbling over the wall. When I finally found it and flicked it on, I turned back to the window. She was gone. But the glass, there was something on it. A single handprint, pressed against the inside. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the handprint, clear, distinct, inside the glass. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as my mind struggled to catch up. She had been on the balcony. I had seen her outside. So how was the handprint on the inside? The room felt wrong. The walls pressed in, the air too thick to breathe. My skin crawled with the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to turn, to scan the apartment. The bedroom door was still shut. The bathroom was empty. The tiny kitchen was silent. I was alone. Wasn't I? My gaze snapped back to the window. The handprint remained, a silent proof that something had happened, that I hadn't imagined it. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking as I fumbled to unlock it. I needed to call someone. Anyone. The police? What would I even say? That my neighbor, who apparently never existed, had left a handprint inside my apartment. No. That would only make me sound insane. Instead, I opened my messages and typed a quick text to my friend, Mark. "Hey, you awake?" I stared at the screen, waiting. The dots appeared, typing. Relief washed over me. "Yeah, what's up?" I hesitated. How could I explain this without sounding like I had lost my mind? "Something weird's happening in my building. I need to get out of here. Can I crash at your place tonight?" The dots appeared again, then stopped, then started again. My pulse pounded in my ears. Finally, the reply came. "Yeah, of course. Everything okay?" "No. I'll explain when I get there." I grabbed my keys and wallet, shoving them into my jacket pocket. My hand lingered on the doorknob. I wasn't sure I wanted to open it. What if something was waiting for me in the hallway? A deep breath, then another. I turned the knob and yanked the door open. The hallway was silent. Dim, the usual flickering light above apartment 306 buzzed softly, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. I stepped out, pulling the door shut behind me. And then, tap, tap, tap. I froze. The sound had come from my door. From inside. No, I wasn't going to think about that right now. I was leaving. I forced myself forward, moving quickly toward the elevator at the end of the hall. Each step echoed unnaturally, as if the building itself was hollow. The closer I got, the more I felt it, something watching me. Not just from behind. From above. From the walls. From the very air. The elevator doors stood in front of me, dull metal reflecting the dim light. I slammed my finger against the button. Nothing. I pressed it again. And again. Nothing. The screen above the doors flickered between floors. 4, 3, 4, 2, 5. What the hell was going on? A creak echoed through the hall. I turned my head, slowly, unwillingly, toward the far end of the corridor. The door to apartment 305 was open. Wide open. Diana's apartment. The one that was supposed to be empty. A soft sound came from within. A whisper. A breath. Or maybe just the building settling. I should leave. Right now. Take the stairs. Get out of here. But my feet moved forward. No. I didn't want to do this. But I did. I stepped closer, each movement careful, deliberate, as if something unseen was pulling me forward. The darkness beyond the door yawned open like a mouth, swallowing what little light the hallway offered. I crossed the threshold. The air inside was stale. Dust clung to the walls, the furniture covered in white sheets. It looked abandoned, but it didn't feel abandoned. A faint pressure in the air, a wrongness that made my stomach twist. I forced myself deeper inside. The layout was almost identical to mine, kitchen on the left, living room straight ahead. And then I saw them. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Scattered across the floor. Pinned to the walls. Taped to the furniture. And they were all of me. Different angles. Different times of day. Some taken from inside my apartment. Others from the hallway. From the balcony. One was from just minutes ago. Me, standing outside Diana's door. My stomach lurched. My body screamed at me to run. But then, from the darkened bedroom, a sound, a whisper, soft, almost gentle. "You shouldn't have come in." A shadow moved, and the door slammed shut behind me. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot, leaving behind a suffocating silence. My body reacted before my mind could. I spun around, lunging for the handle. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal, yanking, twisting, locked. I wasn't alone. The whisper had been real. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the door, forcing myself to scan the room again. The photographs, hundreds of them, stared back at me, their silent evidence pressing into my mind like a weight. Who took them? Why? And then, from the darkened bedroom, the sound of something moving. Slow. Deliberate. A shift in weight, a breath dragging through the still air. I wasn't alone. I forced my feet to move, stepping backward, deeper into the living room. My shoes crunched over the photographs, littering the floor. The images bent, crumpled beneath my weight, and for a sickening moment, I felt like I was stepping on pieces of my own life. Another sound, closer now. The bedroom door creaked as it opened wider. I couldn't see anything past the shadows. But something was there. Watching. I gritted my teeth, my pulse hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I needed to get out. Now. My eyes flicked toward the window. It was the only way. I darted forward, shoving aside the coffee table, sending more photographs scattering. My hands hit the window pane, fumbling for the lock. My fingers trembled as I forced it open, the glass screeching against the frame. Cold air rushed in, sharp against my sweat-dampened skin. The balcony. I didn't have time to hesitate. I hoisted myself through, stumbling onto the concrete floor outside. The metal railing loomed in front of me, and beyond it, my own balcony. If I could just climb over, I could get back into my apartment. Lock the door. Get out of this nightmare. I swung one leg over the railing, the metal biting into my skin. My hands gripped tightly as I started to pull myself across. And then, hands. From the darkness behind me, fingers wrapped around my ankle. Cold. Too cold. A jerk, sudden and violent. I lost my grip. A scream tore from my throat as I slammed against the railing, my ribs colliding with the unforgiving metal. Pain flared, stealing my breath. My other foot kicked wildly, desperate to break free. The grip tightened, and then I saw it. A shape emerging from the shadows of the apartment behind me. Not Diana. Not a person. Something wrong. Too tall. Too thin. The way it moved, unnatural, like it was learning how to use its own limbs for the first time. And its face. No. No, no, no. It was mine. Not a reflection. Not a photograph. My own face staring back at me. But the eyes? Black. Hollow. Empty. I choked on my own scream, my free foot slamming against its grasp, desperation overtaking thought. My heel connected, hard. The thing let out a sound, distorted, not human. A guttural, static-filled echo of something that was never meant to exist. Its grip faltered. I wrenched free. With one final push, I hurled myself over the railing, landing hard on my own balcony. My knee hit the concrete with a sharp crack, but I barely felt it. I scrambled toward my sliding door, yanking it open, throwing myself inside. I spun, hands slamming against the glass, locking it shut. The figure stood motionless on Diana's balcony, watching. I could still see its face. My face. It tilted its head. And then, it smiled. A slow, creeping grin that stretched too wide, too long. The corners of its mouth split, skin cracking like dry paper. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the pain in my ribs said otherwise. The bruises forming on my skin said otherwise. And the thing standing outside, staring at me with my own hollow face. That was real too. I couldn't move. My body had turned to stone, frozen in place as my mind fought to process what I was seeing. The thing on Diana's balcony, my face twisted into something inhuman, watched me with a patience that made my stomach churn. And then it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the glass door. My breath hitched. No. No, no, no. The sound wasn't muffled. It was clear, too clear, as if the glass wasn't separating us at all. Knock. I stumbled back. My heel caught on the edge of the rug, and I nearly lost my balance. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing inward, the air thick and suffocating. Knock. The grin on its face widened, stretching impossibly far. The corners of its mouth tore as it moved, dark veins spiderwebbing beneath the pale surface of its skin. I turned and ran. The hallway leading to my bedroom felt longer than it should have. My legs burned, every step weighed down by an invisible force that made me feel like I was moving through thick, suffocating air. I threw myself into my room, slamming the door behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the lock, twisting it until I heard the satisfying click. Silence. For a few agonizing moments, the only sound was the ragged, uneven rhythm of my breathing. Then, knock. I choked on a breath. Not from the balcony. From my bedroom closet. I whipped around so fast my vision blurred. The closet door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the narrow gap. No. That was impossible. I had been standing in this room the whole time, no one had come in. Knock. The sound was softer this time, almost hesitant. Something was in there. Something had been in there the whole time. I stepped back until I hit the far wall, my fingers gripping the fabric of my shirt as I fought to keep my breath steady. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, loud enough that I was sure whatever was in that closet could hear it. The door creaked. A whisper, low, distorted, like a voice traveling through a broken radio. Let me in. My stomach lurched. No. No, I wouldn't open it. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown it out, trying to force myself to wake up from whatever this was. But then, the doorknob turned. Slowly. Deliberately. The metal rattled against the frame as whatever was inside tried to open the door from the other side. I bolted. My hands flew to the window, yanking it open, letting the cold night air slap me in the face. The fire escape. It was my only way out. I climbed through, the metal grating cold against my palms as I swung myself onto the platform. My breath came in sharp gasps as I hurried downward, my bare feet barely making contact with the steps. The wind howled around me, whipping at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. I hit the ground running, sprinting into the empty street. Only when I was halfway down the block did I make the mistake of looking back. My apartment window was open, the curtains billowing outward like ghostly fingers. And standing there, in the darkness of my room, was me. Watching. Waiting. Smiling. Have you ever seen something that doesn't move until you look away? It was a late shift. Again. The kind that seemed to drag on for hours, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering and buzzing in a rhythm that only added to the tension. I was an overnight security guard in a nearly empty building, some office space that was never fully occupied. No one ever came to work late, except for a few cleaning staff in the evening, and even they didn't linger long. So, I found myself alone more often than not, staring at the camera feeds to pass the time. It was mind-numbing, repetitive work, but it kept me occupied enough to push away thoughts of the silence around me. The cameras weren't high-tech. Basic stuff. Grainy footage, sometimes glitching or freezing for a few seconds. Nothing unusual, except that night. I had just finished my rounds, the usual uneventful walk through the empty hallways. The hallway cameras were set up in the far corners of the building, catching the dim glow of the emergency lights that stayed on through the night. But when I sat back at the security desk, adjusting my chair and preparing for another few hours of boredom, I saw it. A figure. In the corner of the screen, far down the hallway. It was dark, too dark to make out any features. But there was something there, standing completely still in the shadows. I squinted, leaning closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the shape. A person? No, that would be impossible. No one was supposed to be here. The building had been empty for days, and I had just walked through the hall. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, figuring I must have been seeing things. Maybe it was just a shadow cast by something in the room. But no, when I looked back, it was still there, unmoving. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, my heart starting to race. Maybe it's a glitch, I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't it. I had been watching these cameras for months, and I knew every inch of this place. That was no glitch. I forced myself to look away from the screen, trying to calm my mind. My fingers drummed against the desk as I glanced around the room, trying to shake the growing unease in my stomach. The building was silent, too silent. No creaks from the old walls, no hum from the air conditioning, just the low buzz of the overhead lights. I focused on the clock, the second hand ticking away in slow, methodical intervals. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. But when I looked back at the monitor, it was closer. My stomach dropped. The figure hadn't moved, not in any way I could see. But somehow, it was closer. I hadn't blinked, not that I could remember, but it was undeniably nearer to the camera. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly switched to a different camera feed, the one at the end of the hall. It was empty. No figure. I tried to laugh at myself, telling myself that I was just overthinking things. But when I switched back to the original camera, there it was again. Closer. I froze, staring at the screen. It was the same figure, but now it looked more defined, a little taller, its shape sharper against the darkness. And this time, just for a brief moment, I thought I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Its head tilted slightly. It was as though it had heard me looking. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone. I blinked. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, completely still, and I felt a strange wave of relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. I glanced away from the screen again, trying to steady my racing pulse. My fingers brushed against the edge of the desk, but when I looked back, it was closer again. Much closer. I leaned forward in my seat, my throat dry. The darkness of the hallway made the figure seem unnatural, distorted almost, but it wasn't just its appearance that unsettled me. It was the way it had moved, without moving at all. My mind raced. The building was empty, I knew that. I had checked every door, every room before I settled into my seat. There was no one else here. Then why? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The figure was no longer in the corner of the hallway. No, it was now in the middle, standing as if it had always been there. I blinked again, and this time it was standing directly in front of the camera. My breath caught in my throat. It was looking straight at me, and for the first time I could feel my skin crawl with the weight of its gaze. The eyes weren't visible, but I could feel it, its presence pressing down on me. I was no longer staring at a simple figure on a screen. It was alive, aware. The lights flickered. I hurriedly looked away again, my hands shaking as I moved the mouse to pull up another feed. Nothing. I switched back, nothing. But the hallway was still there. The figure still stood in its place, as if mocking me, taunting me with its stillness. And then, it was gone. Just like that. I stared at the screen, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Had I imagined it? I wasn't sure. But the silence, it was too thick now. And the more I stared at the blank screen, the more I realized it wasn't the empty hallway I had seen moments ago. It was the absence. I felt my heartbeat accelerate, a loud drumming in my ears that drowned out the usual hum of the building. The emptiness stretched out before me, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond just a glitch or an overactive imagination. I knew what I had seen. My mind raced as I stared at the blank screen. The hallway was empty, yes, but there was something about the absence of the figure that seemed worse. It was as if the space itself had changed, worked in a way I couldn't explain. The shadows were deeper, the light too harsh, and the silence felt unnatural. I rubbed my eyes, trying to force myself to focus. I glanced at the clock, 2 a.m. The time crawled by, but it didn't matter. It felt like hours had passed. I had to check the other cameras again. Maybe I missed something. I switched to the hallway feed closest to where the figure had been. Still nothing. No movement, no figure, just the same old grainy footage I had seen 100 times before. But the longer I stared at it, the more I became aware of the strange discomfort creeping into my chest. The air felt thick now, like I was breathing through water. It pressed in on me from every direction, pulling at my mind, clouding my thoughts. I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of the stillness around me. Then I heard it. A low creak. I froze. It came from the hallway, the same hallway where I had seen the figure. The sound was so faint I almost thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. Creak. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone there? I quickly switched to the hallway feed again. Still nothing. The empty hallway stretched out before me like a picture with a missing piece. Then the creak came again. Creak. I could almost picture the floorboards shifting beneath something heavy. but there was nothing. I exhaled shakily. It wasn't possible. The building was empty. I was alone. But the sound didn't stop. I could hear it now, a slow and deliberate movement echoing through the camera. It was faint, but undeniable. Someone, or something, was in that hallway, moving towards me. I forced myself to look away from the screen. No, I shouldn't be hearing this. But as the seconds passed, I couldn't ignore it. The creaking was getting louder. Closer. Each shift, each creak seemed to come from just a few steps away from the camera. The lights flickered again. A sharp flash of light, then darkness. My skin tingled with dread, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I clicked back to the hallway camera, the one where I had seen the figure earlier. There was something there. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The shadows seemed deeper, the figure in the corner now more defined. But this time, it was different. The figure wasn't standing still. No, it was slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving forward. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. It was unreal. The figure, a dark mass against the dimly lit hallway, moved inch by inch. But each time I blinked, it was closer. Closer. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry, and my heart felt like it was pounding in my ears. This wasn't a glitch. It couldn't be. I had seen what I had seen. But how was this possible? How could it move like that? I stared harder, trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure had moved from the corner and was now halfway down the hall. Its outline remained distorted, almost as if the darkness itself clung to it, hiding its true form. The air felt wrong, so wrong, like I was being watched. My breathing quickened. I had to do something. I had to check the building. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe someone had snuck in, but the doors were all locked. I glanced at the side cameras. Nothing. The windows were sealed shut, the doors bolted. I was alone in the building. But the figure wasn't alone. It had company. Another creak. A shadow. There was something else, something moving just outside the reach of the camera. I watched, my eyes wide, heart racing as I saw the shape in the corner of the screen, creeping out from the shadows. The darkness was alive. It moved now, shifting in a way that defied all logic. I wasn't imagining it. The figure was no longer a single shape. It had grown. Two more shadows followed behind it, creeping along the walls like sentient creatures, their forms indistinguishable from the blackness itself. I clicked rapidly through the other cameras, but the building was now shrouded in darkness. I looked back to the hallway feed. The original figure was still there, but now it was much closer. Only a few feet away from the camera. It was standing in the hallway, motionless once more. But something had changed. There was a presence behind it. A pair of eyes. I swear I could see them. Deep, hollow, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring directly at me. I jumped back in my chair, my pulse racing. I looked away, then back again. It was still there. The eyes stared at me, watching, waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The lights flickered again, this time for longer. When they came back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure had moved. It wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was right in front of the camera. And it was staring directly at me. I knew it hadn't moved, but it was there. And then, the whisper. It was a sound, soft, almost inaudible. But there was no mistaking it. It was like a voice, a slow, deliberate whisper. The words weren't clear, but I could feel them. It knew I was watching, and the figure was closer than ever. My hands were shaking as I gripped the edges of the desk. The whispering sound lingered in the air, echoing in my mind even though the room was silent. It felt as though the very walls were pressing in on me, suffocating, tightening with every passing second. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, even though I desperately wanted to. It was closer now, almost as if the figure had somehow crossed the threshold of the camera's view without moving an inch. But it had moved. I saw it. It had crossed the line, the invisible border between the corner and the camera. I blinked, unwilling to believe what I was seeing. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was no longer standing still. It was advancing, taking slow, deliberate steps toward me, though I knew that wasn't possible. It was impossible for anything to move while I was watching, right? My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be real. But I saw it. I saw it. The shadow shifted, its outline growing more distinct with every breath I took. The space around it was darker now, as if the figure were sucking the light from the room. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My body was reacting, fighting to break free from the paralysis of fear, but my eyes were still glued to the screen. The whispering came again, more urgent now. It was a voice, but not one I could understand. It felt like a distant murmur, a low growl in a language that didn't belong in this world. I tried to turn away from the camera. I tried to make sense of the situation, to tell myself it was just a glitch, just the camera messing with me. But my body refused to listen. I couldn't look away. The figure was no longer just a shape, it had a presence. It was massive, towering, its silhouette jagged and unnatural. It seemed to stretch out of the shadows, bending the very air around it. And then, suddenly, it was closer. Much closer. I could see its outline shifting, its edges blurring as if it were made of smoke. The air in the room became stifling, thick with an unidentifiable scent, sharp, metallic, almost like something rotting. The stench made me gag, but it was impossible to pull myself away. The screen flickered once more, and the lights in the room dimmed. I slammed my hand onto the desk, shaking myself free from the fog of fear that had settled in my brain. I had to do something. I had to stop it. I reached for the controls to switch to another camera, hoping to get a better look, hoping I could find something that explained all this. But as I clicked, the screen blinked black. I froze. No signal. I slapped the monitor, swore under my breath, and clicked the mouse frantically, but nothing responded. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. The oppressive silence felt deafening, as though the air itself had thickened and was now pressing in on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I stood up from the desk, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't pull myself away from the desk. And then, I heard it. A slow, deliberate footstep. It was coming from the hallway. The same creak I heard earlier. I forced myself to turn toward the hallway door, but it was pitch black, the shadows swallowed by the absence of light. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, but I knew it wouldn't help. I already knew. The figure wasn't going to be there when I checked. It would move when I wasn't looking. The flashlight flickered in my hand, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. My breath was coming faster now, my chest tight. I had to do something, anything. But I didn't know what. I had no plan. My mind raced. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in the room, locked in front of the cameras, knowing what was happening just beyond my view. I started toward the door. The sound of my footsteps was deafening in the quiet, too loud, too echoing. But something wasn't right. I stopped. The feeling hit me like a wave, a crushing, icy cold that settled in the pit of my stomach. It was behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know. I could feel it, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing against my back, suffocating me in the dark. I slowly, reluctantly, turned around, expecting to see nothing but the same empty room. But I was wrong. The black figure stood just inside the doorway. Its shape was no longer just a vague mass of darkness. It had a form now. Its body was tall, too tall, and its limbs stretched unnaturally long. It seemed to have no distinct features, just smooth, dark skin that seemed to absorb the light around it. But I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I could feel them burning into me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was too late. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped backward into the darkness. I didn't see it leave, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. I backed up against the wall, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. I didn't know if I could make it out of this room alive, but I couldn't stay here either. I had to get out. And then another step. Another creak. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. The figure had moved again. The air felt suffocating. My chest tightened with every breath, the thick silence pressing against my lungs as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. I could feel the sweat trickling down my spine, my legs still frozen in place, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. I could still hear it. The faintest, slow drag of footsteps just beyond the threshold. Each sound was a death knell in the stillness, echoing through the room, slicing through my thoughts like a knife. I wanted to move. I had to move. But my legs refused to obey, my mind too clouded by the weight of fear to think clearly. The figure, whatever it was close now, closer than I'd ever seen it before. I could feel its presence like a shadow hanging over me, its heavy, inescapable gaze burning into my skin. I didn't dare turn around. I had to get out of here. There was no other option. But what if it followed me? What if it was already there, just waiting for me to make a move? I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see it standing in the frame, waiting patiently like a predator poised to strike. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Empty. I took a deep breath and forced my feet to move, the cold tile floor slippery beneath my shoes. I moved toward the door, my pulse racing, my fingers reaching out for the handle. But the instant my hand brushed the cold metal, I froze. The whispering, the voice that had been just a murmur, now rose in pitch, growing louder with every passing second. It wasn't a voice at all, but something else, an inhuman sound, a scraping noise, like nails on a chalkboard, only deeper, more guttural. Closer. Closer. I didn't wait to hear the next sound. My heart skipped a beat as I ripped the door open and bolted into the hallway, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark. The hallway stretched out before me, long and empty, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering sporadically, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. I ran. My footsteps echoed, louder than they should have been, as if the sound was being amplified by the very walls around me. The hallway seemed to grow longer with each step, the exit door at the end growing farther and farther away, despite my desperate sprint. I could feel it now, the presence. It wasn't just behind me anymore. It was in front of me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. My entire body screamed at me to keep running, to not slow down, to not stop. Every instinct in my body told me that if I stopped, if I turned around, I would see something I wasn't ready to see, something that would break me. The door. The exit door. It was right there, just a few steps away. I was almost there. But then I heard it again. That sound, the faintest shift in the air, the creak of floorboards. But this time, it wasn't behind me. It was in front of me. It was blocking the door. I could feel it, like a weight pressing against the very space I occupied. The air grew dense, suffocating, as if the room itself had become a living thing, pulling me into its depths, suffocating me with its hunger. No. No. I stopped, suddenly paralyzed. It was too late. The figure had moved. It had moved again, and now it was between me and the door. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. I could feel its presence like a cold shadow wrapping around me, its proximity so overwhelming that I could taste the fear in the back of my throat. I could hear it now, the scraping sound, louder. It was closer. I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see it. Not clearly. It was just a blur in the shadows, a dark shape shifting in and out of existence. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I swung it wildly, my pulse quickening, but the light didn't help. The shadows only seemed to multiply, stretch farther into the hallway, twisting and writhing like living things. I should have screamed. I should have run. But I couldn't. And then, the whispering started again. But this time, it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just a murmur in the air anymore. It was words, disjointed, frantic, but unmistakable. I couldn't understand them, but I knew they were meant for me. I could feel them, like claws raking at my skin. It was speaking to me. Look at me. The words slithered through my mind, sending a chill down my spine. Look at it? I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. If I did, I would never unsee it. I would never be able to erase the image from my mind. Look at me. I felt the words like a physical force, pushing me toward it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet were cemented to the floor, my body frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer force of the thing in front of me. It was so close now. So close that I could hear it breathing. A low, wet rasp, like 1,000 voices speaking through a single, dying throat. I couldn't look. But my eyes were betraying me. They drifted, just for a second, toward the dark corner of the hallway. And there it was. The black figure. Its shape had become more defined, more solid. Its outline was still jagged, its limbs impossibly long, but now I could see the face. I wish I hadn't. It was almost human, but not quite. The face was wrong, stretched in ways that no human face should be, the features shifting, morphing like something out of a nightmare. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They weren't eyes. They were empty, hollow, black pits. But I could feel them. I could feel them looking at me. And then it spoke again. It's too late. And I knew in that moment that it was right. It was too late. Too late for everything. The world twisted, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The floor beneath my feet was no longer solid. It felt like soft earth, as if I were sinking into the very foundation of this place. My legs wobbled, and my head spun as I stared at the figure, still frozen in place, its hollow eyes boring into me. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by fear, caught in a trance, a force greater than my will. The whispering, it never stopped. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, crawling under my skin. Its voice filled my ears like static, jagged and alien, pulling me deeper into its reach. Look at me. But I didn't want to. I couldn't. I shouldn't. But my eyes betrayed me. They drifted back, drawn unwillingly toward the figure. It was closer now, too close, and I could feel it reaching out for me, something horrible and dark pressing in on all sides. Its form was shifting, never staying still, like smoke that refused to settle. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my brain to block it out. Just a few more steps. Just reach the door. But my body refused to obey. The moment I opened my eyes, it was even closer. I could smell it now, an acrid, burnt scent that curled in the back of my throat, mixing with the stale air. I didn't want to breathe it in, but I couldn't stop myself. It was suffocating, as though the air had thickened to the point where I couldn't escape. The whispering became louder, more insistent. Look at me. My heart hammered in my chest. My legs screamed for movement, but my mind couldn't break free from the command. I was trapped in this sickening cycle, drawn closer and closer to it, inch by inch. I could feel it now, that oppressive weight in the room, suffocating me from all directions. I didn't dare look up, but the sensation of its eyes, that emptiness, was growing sharper. It was too real, too overwhelming. The air felt so thick, like something was closing in on me from every side. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everything seemed to be tightening, closing in like a trap. I had to scream. I had to call for help. But no sound came out. The room was no longer a room. The hallway, no longer a hallway. The walls twisted like grotesque veins, pulsing with unnatural life, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that leapt and crawled across the floor. Then, suddenly, the thing spoke again, its voice like a dagger tearing through my skull. You are mine now. And in that instant, it felt real. I felt its presence not just in the room, but inside me. I could feel it wrapping itself around my heart, sinking into my chest, clawing through my veins like a parasite. It was no longer just a shadow, it had become part of me. It was inside my head. I had to move. I had to escape. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My hands trembled violently, reaching out toward the door, but as I took a step forward, the floor gave way beneath me. The ground cracked open, as if the very foundation of the building had become unstable, swallowing everything. I stumbled, my foot catching on nothing but empty air, and I fell. But there was no floor beneath me anymore. I was falling into darkness. Everything blurred into a whirl of blackness and distorted shapes, a void that seemed endless, as though I were plunging deeper and deeper into the heart of the unknown. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and I could hear it again, the whispering, but it wasn't just a voice now. It was a presence, overwhelming, consuming me. And then I landed. The impact was soft, like sinking into thick, wet earth, but I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My body ached. I struggled to breathe, the air thick with something damp and suffocating. I tried to stand, but my limbs felt heavy, so heavy. It felt as though the world itself was pressing down on me, crushing me beneath its weight. Where am I? The question screamed in my mind, but the answer never came. I looked around, my head spinning. The hallway. It was no longer the same. The walls stretched out endlessly, the floor cracked and warped as though the building itself had turned into a living thing. Shadows curled around the corners, moving like creatures, stalking me. I pushed myself up, the floor beneath me uneven, like I was standing on unstable ground. I had to get out. I had to leave. But where was the exit? Where was the door? I looked up. The figure was still there, standing in the corner, but now it wasn't just a shadow. It was solid, alive, its grotesque shape shifting and pulsating in time with the whispers that grew louder, more aggressive. Look at me, it hissed again, its form growing more distorted. Its eyes, or the lack of them, burned into me, pulling me closer. I couldn't escape. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The floor beneath me groaned, the walls closing in as if the space itself was alive. I turned to flee, but the hallway seemed endless, stretching out before me like a maze with no way out. Every direction led to the same twisted, empty corridor, the same looming shadow that followed my every movement. I couldn't outrun it. I fell to my knees, exhausted, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The figure was getting closer. I could hear it now, the sound of its limbs dragging across the floor, the sharp, wet rasp of its movements. And then, a voice, not the one I had heard before, but my own, screamed through my mind. It's never going to let me go. The words were not my own, but they felt true. It was inside me. Inside my head. It would never leave. I would never leave. The last thing I saw was its face. The face that wasn't quite human, the face that wasn't meant to be seen, and as it opened its mouth, no, not a mouth, something worse, a chill ran through me, and I understood. It had one, and I would never leave. The screen went black. The cameras cut off. It was a regular evening. The kind that feels like nothing could ever go wrong, but I should have known better. I should have known that something was about to shift. It started with the phone call. The one that didn't make any sense. I was sitting on the couch in my apartment, scrolling through the news. The city outside was its usual self, busy, distant, indifferent. The hum of traffic blended with the soft flicker of streetlights, and for a moment, I could almost forget how alone I felt. The phone rang. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was my own number. For a moment, I just stared at it. I'd seen weird things before, but this was something else entirely. There was no way it could be me calling myself. I had just put my phone down. I hadn't called anyone. But there it was, my number flashing across the screen, insistent and demanding. I picked up the phone, my heart starting to beat a little faster than usual. I didn't know why, but I had a bad feeling. a feeling that something wasn't right. "Hello?" I said, voice shaky. The line was silent. For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard. Maybe it was a mistake. Then, I heard it. A faint sound on the other end of the line. Something heavy. A slow, uneven breathing. Deep, labored gasps. It felt like the air was thickening with every breath. I pulled the phone away, almost instinctively, to check the screen again. My number still stared back at me. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Who was on the other end? Was someone messing with me? I hesitated, but I put the phone back to my ear. The breathing continued. Then, a voice. But not just any voice. It was my own. "Don't come back home," it said. The words were cold. Detached. Like a warning, but somehow detached from any logic. My blood ran cold. The voice was mine, but it wasn't. The sound of my breath in the phone was the only thing I could hear after that. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. But the voice didn't answer again. Instead, the sound of the breathing grew more intense. It was almost familiar, but not in a way I wanted it to be. Something about it sent shivers down my spine. "Don't come back home." Again. I dropped the phone. The line went dead. For a moment, everything was silent, and I didn't know what to do. The calmness of the city outside seemed to mock me as I stared at the phone on the floor. My own number. It felt like I had just been given a warning from someone. No, something I couldn't understand. It didn't make any sense. I shook my head. My heart was racing now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. "It's just a prank." That's all it was, I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had to get out of there. Something about the apartment felt off. The walls seemed to close in, the lights flickered faintly, and the air felt too still, too stagnant. As I walked towards the door, I couldn't help but glance back at the phone. It was still on the ground, silent and waiting. Like it was just waiting for something. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. But then, a sound stopped me in my tracks. The breathing. I turned around quickly, heart thumping in my chest. It was coming from the phone. I backed away, the hallway feeling longer than it should have been. The walls looked different. They weren't the same walls I had walked past just moments ago. Everything felt unfamiliar. Was I losing my mind? My thoughts were racing as I made my way to the stairwell. Each step felt like it took longer, the sound of my feet against the floor growing louder, more oppressive. As I reached the landing, I could feel something shift again. A subtle change. The air was thick now, almost suffocating. I turned to look back at the apartment door, and that's when I noticed it. A shadow. It was small at first, just a blur at the corner of the hallway, but it grew larger with every second I stood there. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the shadow had disappeared. Was someone there? Or was it my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know what was worse anymore. I ran out the door. The street outside was bright, full of life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following me. The same breath I had heard on the phone was now in the back of my mind. The feeling that I was being watched, hunted, lingered. I shouldn't have answered the call. The streets outside were busy, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling under my skin. It was as if I was walking through someone else's world. Every face seemed unfamiliar, every car too loud, every shadow too deep. I kept checking my phone, hoping to distract myself, but there was nothing, no message, no missed calls, just the hollow hum of the screen. What had just happened? I kept replaying that moment in my head. The voice on the phone, the way it sounded so exactly like mine, but colder, more distant. It wasn't just a prank, it was a warning. But why would I know? Who would call me and tell me not to come back home? And how was it my own voice? I walked faster, my mind racing. My feet moved almost mechanically as I passed familiar shops and cafes, but none of them felt the same. They were like cheap replicas of places I had known for years, like a blurry version of the world. The whole neighborhood seemed muted, like someone had turned down the volume on life itself. Then it hit me, the sound. The breathing. It had followed me, hadn't it? I felt it in the air, almost as if the very atmosphere was thick with it. It wasn't just on the phone anymore, it was here. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just a couple walking by, absorbed in their conversation. I shook my head. It's just your imagination. But still, I couldn't help but quicken my pace. I needed to get somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here, that wasn't my apartment. Maybe if I just leave, it will all go away. The thought barely calmed me before I heard it. A slight rustling behind me, too faint to be anything concrete. Just the wind, just the wind. I repeated it over and over in my head, but it wasn't the wind. I was sure of it now. Someone was following me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps echoed in my ears, but when I turned around, nothing. It was like the moment I looked, it stopped. Like whoever, or whatever, was following me didn't want me to see them. This wasn't right. I spun back around and began walking faster, my feet stumbling slightly as I pushed myself to keep moving. I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't even go back to the street I knew. Everything felt wrong. Like I had crossed some invisible line into a place that didn't belong. The phone. Where was it? I pulled it out again, half expecting to see my own number flash on the screen once more. I half expected to hear that breath again. But this time, there was something different. A new message. It was from my own number. The words on the screen were simple. Too simple. Don't ignore me. My blood ran cold. My fingers trembled as I read it again. The message was still there, the same cold words staring back at me like a mockery. The sound of my breath was in my ears now, rising with every second that passed. It was my breath, but it didn't feel like mine. It felt wrong. I wiped my palms on my jeans, trying to steady myself. This has to be a mistake. Maybe a glitch, some weird thing happening with my phone. But why was my number showing up everywhere? Why was I getting messages from myself? I reached the corner, my eyes scanning the street for a safe place to go, but everything felt too exposed, too public. The same uneasy feeling tugged at me like an invisible thread, pulling me back toward the street where my apartment was. I took a deep breath and forced myself to turn down a different alley. But the moment I did, I knew I shouldn't have. The street was darker here, quieter. A low hum from a broken streetlight cast a dim glow, illuminating the alley ahead. I looked down, instinctively checking my phone again, but this time I saw it. A figure, standing across the street, completely still. It wasn't moving, but it was there. For a moment, I thought it was a person just standing under the light, waiting for something, maybe even someone. But then I saw it, the shadow that stretched unnaturally long. I blinked and the figure shifted. Not moved. Shifted. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. The longer I looked, the more it felt like the figure was changing. Growing taller. Impossible. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I took a cautious step back. The figure seemed to be growing darker, its shape more distorted, but still motionless. Don't look away. I heard it again. The same voice that had haunted me on the phone, the one that had echoed through my mind. This time, I could feel the weight of its presence even without hearing it. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was there. My hands trembled as I lifted the phone. I didn't know why, but I found myself dialing my number. It rang once. Twice. The third ring was cut off by the sound of a distorted voice on the other end. I told you not to look away. I dropped the phone. It fell to the ground with a sharp crack. The air around me felt like it was closing in. The streetlights flickered. The shadows shifted. And as I turned to run, I heard it again. That heavy breathing, following me, always just out of reach. Don't come back home. But now I wasn't sure which was worse. The voice telling me to stay away, or the one that was starting to tell me I was too far gone to leave. I didn't look back as I ran. My feet hit the pavement hard, each step echoing in the dead silence of the alley. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it nearly deafening over the heavy, unnatural breathing that followed me. It was there again, just like before. The steady, raspy sound, like someone breathing heavily into the phone. But I wasn't on the phone anymore. My hands were slick with sweat, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Why was this happening? Why me? The alley twisted, the streetlights overhead flickering sporadically, casting shadows that seemed to stretch too far. The air around me felt thick, as if the world itself was slowly suffocating, pressing down on me. I turned another corner, trying to lose myself in the maze of streets, but every step felt heavier than the last. The oppressive weight of it all was too much. I had to get to safety. But where was safe? I didn't trust the apartment anymore. I didn't trust the world around me. Every street, every building was suddenly unfamiliar. The faces I passed didn't seem to notice me, didn't seem to notice the air was wrong. I had to get away. Somewhere, anywhere, away from the shadows that were closing in. Suddenly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slower now, deliberate. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was just ahead. Not too far. It was like the world had gone silent except for that. The footsteps. Slow. Steady. I backed up instinctively, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. It was too quiet, too still. I turned down another street, only to find it blocked by a row of parked cars. No exit. No way out. I spun around again. The footsteps, they were closer now. Too close. I pressed my back against a brick wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The air seemed to hum with tension, thick and suffocating. I could barely breathe. Could barely think. I glanced down at my phone again. Nothing. No messages, no calls, no signs of life. Just the screen, lit up by the faint glow of the dying streetlight. And then it came again. The voice. You should have listened. I dropped the phone, but the voice didn't stop. It was as if it was in my head now, in my very thoughts. It wasn't just a sound. It was real. Real in the way that a nightmare feels real, even after you wake up. It was as if my own thoughts were twisting against me. It's already too late. I swallowed hard. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see anything. No figure in the distance. No sign of anything out of place. Yet, I knew it was here. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. The breathing, the voice, it was everywhere now. It was in the walls. It was in the air. It was here. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The silence was deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave this street, this town, this reality, wherever I was. It felt like the ground itself was shifting beneath me. I couldn't trust anything. I couldn't trust myself. I started walking again, slowly this time, my mind reeling. I needed to get to the bus station. To get somewhere, anywhere, where I could disappear. But no matter how fast or slow I moved, it felt like I was walking in place. The buildings around me kept changing. The windows that should have been there weren't. The street signs were replaced with blank, dull facades that seemed to blur into the background. I rounded another corner and froze. The figure was standing in front of me now. The same figure from the alley. But this time, it was closer. Too close. I could see its features now. It was wearing my jacket, my jeans, my shoes. The figure was me, but it wasn't. It was distorted, its face stretched too thin, too pale, like a mask that was about to tear. The eyes, those eyes. Hollow, empty, like they were staring right through me. The figure was frozen in place, but its gaze never left mine. And then the breathing started again. Only this time, it was coming from me. I tried to move, to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. My feet felt glued to the pavement. The air grew colder, the streetlights flickered again, and the world around me started to distort, stretching, bending, like the whole world was warping. The edges of my vision blurred. The figure, the one that looked like me, began to move. Slowly. Unnaturally. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. It was like my voice had been stolen, like my body wasn't mine anymore. The figure took a step forward. Then another. The sound of its footsteps, my footsteps, echoed through the street. It was so close now. Too close. You can't run, it whispered, its voice low, hoarse. My voice. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned and ran again, my body moving on instinct. I could hear the figure following me, its steps now more like a shadow, faster, closer, as if the distance between us didn't matter. I stumbled into a narrow alley and looked back one last time, my breath coming in desperate gasps. But it was gone. The street was empty again, eerily silent. Just the hum of the streetlights and the wind rustling through the trees. But something was wrong. I could feel it. It was as if the world had shifted again. My phone buzzed. I almost didn't want to check it. But I did. There was a new message. From my own number. It's not over. I froze. I didn't know what to do anymore. The world felt like it was breaking apart, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it together. I stared at the message on my phone, my hands trembling. The words felt like a punch to the gut. It's not over. It was as though the phone itself had become a tether, binding me to something I couldn't escape. The alley was silent now, the oppressive stillness suffocating. The wind had stopped, and the streetlights above seemed to flicker in rhythm with my panicked heartbeat. What was happening? What was real? I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself, but it only made things worse. The air smelled wrong, thick, metallic, like something was burning in the distance. I felt it again, that heavy presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It was all around me. Was it real, or was my mind breaking? I turned and started walking, slow at first, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. It felt as if the world around me was warping, stretching and bending. The buildings seemed too tall, too close. The sky above me too low. Everything was closing in. I had to get out of here. But where? I couldn't go home. Not anymore. Not after whatever that was. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look at it, but I did. The message was from my own number. Again. You should have listened. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The voice. The figure. It was all connected. But to what? To me? Was I going crazy? Or was something else going on here? I looked around, panic surging in my chest, but everything was still. Too still. It was like I was the only one left in the world. I needed to find answers, but the deeper I tried to dig, the more it felt like the earth was swallowing me whole. My feet moved on their own, guided by some instinct I didn't fully understand. The world was pushing me, guiding me towards something. Something I couldn't outrun. I reached the end of the alley and stepped into a quiet street. My phone buzzed again, louder this time, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. This time, I hesitated. I knew what it would say, but I opened it anyway. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before I read the words. You can't escape. It's already inside. Inside. Inside me? Inside the world around me? What was inside? My head was spinning. I was suffocating. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The footsteps. The sound was unmistakable, slow and deliberate, just like before. The footsteps were behind me again, but I couldn't see anyone. I tried to turn, to look, but the world around me shifted again. The street I thought I knew, the familiar store windows, the cracked sidewalks, was gone. Instead, I was standing in front of a large, dark building. I had never seen it before. It didn't belong here. The footsteps were closer now. Too close. I stepped back, my heart hammering. There was no way out. The building was tall, ominous. The windows were dark, the doors locked tight. I could feel the presence behind me, creeping, suffocating. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks anymore. This was real. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head. I pulled at the door handle. Locked. I tried again, panic clawing at my throat. The footsteps were just steps away now. I spun around and saw nothing. Nothing. But I could still hear it. I could feel it. I ran, but my legs were like lead. Every step felt like a mile, every breath a struggle. I passed the alley again. I thought I saw something, someone standing there, just out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Was I hallucinating? No. This was real. This was happening. And it was happening to me. The world was cracking. Everything I thought I knew was slipping through my fingers. I stumbled into the street, my breath ragged and shallow, my heart a constant drumbeat in my ears. Then, I saw something in the distance. A figure. It stood in the middle of the street, motionless. It was me. My reflection. But there was something wrong with it. Its face, asterisk, my face, asterisk, was pale, twisted. Its eyes, wide open, stared at me with an intensity one couldn't explain. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. And then, it spoke. I warned you. The voice was mine, but distorted, like it was coming from a deep well. It was like hearing an echo, a version of myself that I couldn't escape. No. I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't supposed to happen. I felt a sickening chill crawl up my spine. My vision blurred, and the air around me seemed to warp, the buildings bending in impossible angles. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence in the pit of my stomach. Was this the end? I tried to run again, but the figure didn't let me go. Its eyes, asterisk, my eyes, asterisk, never left me. And for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just me in the world anymore. It was something else. Something I couldn't run from. I turned and sprinted down the street, desperate, the footsteps following me like a shadow. The figure still stared, and its voice, my voice, lingered in the air like a curse. You will never escape. I ran. But no matter where I went, it followed. I was trapped. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was collapsing under the weight of what I had just seen, what I had just heard. The figure. My own reflection, staring back at me with those unnatural, lifeless eyes. Every step I took felt like it was pushing me deeper into a nightmare, but no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast my feet carried me, the figure was always there, in the corner of my vision. Watching. Waiting. I turned a corner, hoping to lose it, but the world around me twisted, contorted into shapes I couldn't understand. The buildings, once familiar, were now alien, their facades stretching and bending in ways that defied logic. I reached for my phone again, hoping for some kind of answer, some thread of normalcy to pull me back, but all it did was buzz again. I told you not to come back. The message came from my own number. I stared at the screen for a moment, frozen in disbelief. What did it mean? What was it trying to tell me? A strange buzzing sound filled the air, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It vibrated in my bones, making my teeth ache, rattling my mind. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the pressure only grew stronger, pressing on my temples, making my vision flicker. No. This wasn't real. I shook my head violently. I needed to focus. I needed to think. The figure was still out there, somewhere. I could feel it. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was following. I started walking faster, then running again, my feet slapping against the cracked pavement. But every corner I turned led me back to where I started. The same alley, the same street, the same dark building. I wanted to scream, to tear my hair out, but I couldn't. It felt like something was clawing at my throat, holding me in place. The harder I tried to escape, the more everything around me seemed to loop back on itself. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. This time, they weren't just behind me. They were ahead of me too. Everywhere. They grew louder, faster, a relentless rhythm that seemed to drive me deeper into panic. I kept running, ignoring the stitch in my side, the rising panic in my chest. I had to get out. I had to. And then, I saw it. The reflection. No. Not again. It was standing at the end of the street, a twisted version of myself, frozen in place, its eyes glowing like burning coals. It was waiting. I stopped. I couldn't move. My legs were leaden, my mind racing. The figure opened its mouth, but no words came out. Only a low, guttural sound, like a growl rising from deep within its throat. I was trapped. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. This was my fate, wasn't it? To be haunted by my own self. By something not quite me. The phone buzzed again. It's already too late. My breath hitched. The words from the phone felt like a death sentence. Too late? Too late for what? I backed away, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a suffocating blanket. Every step I took felt wrong, the ground beneath me shifting in unnatural ways, as if reality itself was crumbling. I had to get away. I had to get home. But that thought was like a knife in my mind. Home. What was home now? The reflection didn't move, but I felt its presence behind me, a heavy, suffocating force pressing down on me, wrapping around me. I turned and ran again, but the world seemed to fold in on itself. The same streets. The same alley. The same twisted, unrecognizable buildings. I was stuck. Trapped in this nightmare with no escape. The phone buzzed again, and I couldn't help but look. You can't hide. I looked up, my heart racing. The figure was right there, standing in front of me now, its eyes fixed on mine. My own eyes. Its mouth opened wider, wider than it should have been possible, and for the first time, I saw it, the thing behind the eyes. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. There was a black, swirling emptiness in its gaze, a void that seemed to suck the light from the air around it. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me from every side. The buzzing in my ears grew louder, a maddening sound that drowned out everything else. I couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky and unnatural, like it was being pulled by strings I couldn't see. It reached out with a hand, my hand, and I saw that it was already covered in shadow. The skin stretched unnaturally, the fingers too long, the nails too sharp. It wasn't me. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the horror before me. Please, let it be a dream. Please, just let me wake up. But there was no waking up. There was no escape. I had become part of it. And as the shadowed hand reached for me, I heard my own voice again, distorted and hollow. It's too late now. And the world went dark. I woke up with a start. The quiet of my bedroom felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of silence I was used to. It was suffocating, thick, almost as if the room itself were holding its breath. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I couldn't tell why. Then I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, on the floor, clear as day, were wet, muddy footprints. Bare feet, leaving a trail from my bed to the front door. The floor was cold, the kind of chill that usually lingers in the early morning hours, but these tracks were fresh, as if someone had just walked through my room. I froze. I was alone. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't seen anyone leave. The apartment was empty. I'd made sure of it before I went to bed. So where did these tracks come from? Who had walked through my room while I slept? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a wave of unease flooding through me. My stomach churned. I took a deep breath, trying to force some logic into my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just water from the sink. Maybe I'd accidentally left a window open and the rain had blown in. I had to calm down. I swung my legs off the bed and stepped closer to the footprints. The moisture had already started to dry, but the impression of each step was still clear, like an invisible hand had guided it. They didn't look accidental. They were deliberate, paced, as though someone, or something, had made a point to walk carefully, leaving no splashes, just damp prints, clean and methodical. I followed the trail with my eyes, heart hammering in my chest. The tracks led straight to the door. The front door. I glanced at the door, now feeling the weight of its presence. I hadn't heard it open. I hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. But those prints, they were real. I got from the bed, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The air felt dense, almost thick, as I moved closer to the door. Each step I took seemed to echo in the empty apartment. The faint smell of damp earth clung to the air, mixing with the usual scent of stale coffee. I reached the door, hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the handle and twisted. It was locked. I turned the handle again, just to be sure. It was definitely locked. I had locked it myself last night. So who, or what, had left those tracks? I pulled the door open, expecting to see something, anything, that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, just as it had been the night before. I stepped out cautiously, my breath shallow, the pounding in my ears louder than ever. The silence was overwhelming, too complete, like it was suffocating me. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the air moving in and out of my chest. But that was all. I looked down the hallway again, the same empty stretch of walls and closed doors, no sign of anyone having been here. The tracks on the floor were still there, leading straight to the door. I stepped back inside my apartment, closing the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, trying to piece together what I was feeling. There was no way those tracks could have appeared on their own. I stepped closer to the marks again, crouching down to get a better look. There was a strange sheen to them now, as though something had been added to the moisture, something that made the tracks glisten faintly in the dim light. I could almost hear the soft scraping of each print, the silence turning oppressive, like it was mocking me. It felt like the walls were closing in. The stillness of the apartment became unbearable. Every inch of my body screamed at me to get out, but I couldn't leave. Something kept me rooted in place, as if this, whatever was happening, was pulling me in, dragging me deeper. I reached out a hand, trembling slightly, and touched the closest print. It was cold. I jumped back, heart racing, feeling the panic surge through my veins. I hadn't expected that. My fingertips tingled from the contact, as if a faint electric current had passed through me. But it wasn't a shock. It was something else. Something strange and wrong. I backed away from the tracks, but the feeling didn't leave. I could still sense them, as if they were calling to me, drawing me closer. I needed answers. But as I looked at the empty room around me, I realized that maybe I already knew. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone after all. The sound of something shifting behind me made me whirl around. My breath hitched in my throat. Nothing. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. The air grew thicker again. The silence louder. I swallowed, forcing myself to move, to think clearly. But even as I reached for my phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still here. I stood there, holding my phone in my trembling hands, staring at the screen like it might offer some explanation. The silence pressed in from all sides, the eerie stillness wrapping itself around me. The sound of my own breath was deafening, almost too loud. I glanced at the screen, then back at the wood tracks that now seemed to stretch further into the apartment than they had before. I could feel the weight of the air, heavy and thick, pressing against my chest. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that it was just a weird dream or some sort of psychological trick. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a dream. The tracks had started out near my bed, but now they seemed to span almost halfway across the living room floor. Had I missed them? No. I was sure they hadn't been there before. I hadn't moved from my spot by the door. I hadn't even turned my back on them. I stepped forward, cautiously, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The prints were becoming clearer now, almost too vivid, as if they were burned into the very fabric of the apartment. But something about them was off. There was no smear of wetness in the air, no dampness on the floor around the footprints. It was as if they were dry. I crouched down again to examine them more closely. As I did, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up once more. There, in the dim light, I saw something else. A faint outline in the direction the tracks led, something that didn't quite belong. A shadow. It wasn't right, though. The shadow didn't align with anything in the room. There were no windows nearby, no lights casting strange reflections. The shape moved, but not in the natural way a shadow would. It seemed to stretch and shrink, as if it were alive, as if it were shifting of its own will. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to take form, faint, disjointed shapes that made no sense. It was like staring into the void, something dark and incomprehensible slowly pulling at my mind. I could feel the panic rising again, my heart racing faster, my hands now slick with sweat. I stood up quickly, backing away from the shadows, but they followed me. I shook my head, trying to pull myself together. This couldn't be happening. I was imagining things. My phone, my lifeline, was still in my hand, offering no help, no comfort. I needed to do something. I needed to get out. The air felt colder now, and the silence was broken only by the frantic beat of my pulse. I took a few shaky steps backward, my feet crunching against the carpet as I reached the wall. But as I stepped back, I noticed something. The wet footprints had grown. They were longer, stretching into the hallway now. More of them. The floor creaked behind me, drawing my attention. No, not behind me, beside me. I spun around. My eyes widened in terror. There was something there. It was hard to make out at first, just a blur of shadows, an indistinct shape. But then it solidified, and I could see it clearly, a figure standing just past the doorway to the kitchen. I could barely make out the outline of a person, their silhouette dark and indistinct against the light of the hallway. Their form was stretched unnaturally tall, almost impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to elongate in strange ways. I couldn't see their face, only the vague outline of a head and a vague shape where their shoulders should have been. It was like a distorted version of a human being, but its features weren't right. It didn't move. It just stood there, in the doorway, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I felt frozen in place, my feet glued to the floor. My hand was still clutching my phone, but I couldn't make myself dial the number I desperately needed to call. It was as if my body refused to listen to my mind. The figure made a slight motion, its impossibly long arm, reaching out toward me. The fingers were too long, the joints too angular, bending in ways they shouldn't. It wasn't reaching for me, not yet. It was as if it was feeling the air around me, exploring the space between us. The shadows swirled around it, thickening and deepening like a living thing, and the room grew even colder. The temperature seemed to drop with every breath I took, and I could feel the chill in my bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure retreated into the shadows, vanishing back into the dark corner of the kitchen. I stood there, my eyes straining to see where it had gone. But there was nothing there. The apartment was silent again. Too silent. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I took one cautious step forward. Then another. The wet tracks were still there, leading into the hallway, but the figure, whatever it was gone. I needed to understand. I had to figure out what was happening. But something inside me screamed to stop, to leave, to run away and never look back. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had come for me. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The room around me seemed to pulse, the silence now broken by the faint sound of something shifting, soft, deliberate movements. From the kitchen, I wasn't alone anymore. I glanced around, but the apartment still looked the same quiet, familiar space. But it no longer felt safe. It felt like a trap, a cage, and I was the prey. I took a step back, my heart racing as my eyes darted across the room, searching for any sign of movement. The apartment looked the same, nothing had changed outwardly. The walls, the furniture, the windows, all perfectly ordinary. But I knew it wasn't. Something was here, something I couldn't see but felt deep in my gut. The silence felt like it was closing in on me, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a fog. It wasn't just the silence of an empty room, it was the silence of waiting, of something crouching, watching. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, my breath shallow and quick. I forced myself to take another step, but the wet prints, those damn tracks, had moved again. They hadn't just stayed where they were, they had followed me. How was that possible? The tracks were now deeper, as though something heavy had walked through them. But there was still no moisture on the floor, no signs of water anywhere. It didn't make sense. I took a shaky breath and crouched down to look at the prints more closely, trying to make sense of them. The shape of the tracks was uneven, as though the footsteps had not been made by human feet at all. There were odd indentations, strange angles that didn't fit with the natural way of walking. It was almost as though the person, if it was a person, was limping or dragging something behind them. My mind reeled, trying to come up with an explanation, any explanation. Could this be some kind of prank? A nightmare? I couldn't bring myself to believe it. The tracks seemed too deliberate, too real. I stood up and turned toward the hallway. The dark doorway to the kitchen was just a few steps away, the shadows inside seeming to shift like something was waiting just beyond my sight. I wasn't alone. The sound of my footsteps was the only thing I could hear now, each one louder than the last, echoing off the walls. I reached the hallway, my hands gripping the doorframe for support. The kitchen was eerily quiet. But something was different now. There was a smell. A faint, musty odor lingered in the air, something wet and decaying, like the smell of old leaves after a rainstorm. The scent seemed to hang in the room, thick and suffocating. I had never smelled it before, and it made my stomach turn. I reached for the light switch, but my hand stopped just before I could flip it. I heard it. A faint rustling, just behind me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creak of the house settling. This was something else. The soft scraping sound of feet moving slowly, deliberately. It came from the other side of the room, the living room, where I had just come from. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, just past the kitchen doorway, I saw it. A shape. Not the figure from before. This was something different. It was hard to make out at first, a shifting shadow at the edge of my vision. It was just standing there, unmoving, but the longer I stared, the more details emerged. A tall, slender figure, far too tall, like it was stretched beyond the boundaries of normal human proportions. It seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. The shape was wrong. The way it moved, or didn't move, too jerky, too unnatural. I gasped, the air in my lungs suddenly freezing, my whole body shaking. I didn't know whether to scream or run. I couldn't do either. My legs were frozen in place, the weight of something pressing down on me, anchoring me to the spot. Then it moved, slowly, almost too slowly, like it was savoring every second. The shape leaned forward just enough for me to make out the twisted outline of its face. It wasn't a face at all, not really. There were features, but they didn't belong together. It was a jumble of distorted, uneven shapes, eyes that were too big, a mouth stretched wide, like a grotesque mask barely held together. The shadow of its head tilted, almost in curiosity. My body refused to move. I felt my muscles lock, my mind racing through every possible escape, but none of them felt real. What was that thing? It began to glide toward me, the movement so fluid it didn't seem possible. Its form blurred in and out of focus, as though it was not fully part of this world. With each inch it came closer, the air grew colder, the smell of decay stronger. Then, suddenly, it spoke. Not in words, not in anything I could understand, but in a low, guttural sound, like a whisper in the dark. It didn't come from its mouth, or anywhere near its face. The sound seemed to echo in my skull, reverberating through my bones, rattling my teeth. I couldn't hear it clearly, but I felt it. It was as though the sound wasn't meant to be heard, but to be felt, to crawl inside my mind, to worm its way into my thoughts and twist them. I could feel my heart race faster, my breathing shallow, the blood pounding in my ears. I knew, somehow, that it wasn't just a sound. It was something deeper, something ancient, pressing against my mind, trying to make itself known. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The figure was getting closer now, and I was starting to realize that no matter how far I backed up, it would always be right there, watching me. I wasn't getting away. Just as it seemed like it was about to reach me, something shifted in the room. A loud crack, sharp and sudden, split the air, and the figure froze. I turned, my eyes wide with disbelief. The door. The front door. It had opened. My breath caught in my throat. The door had been closed tightly just moments ago. Now it was wide open, the cold night air flooding in. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I ran. I bolted past the figure, barely hearing the soft, rustling footsteps behind me, as though it were following, but not chasing. It was watching. Always watching. I didn't stop until I was out the door, into the cold night, gasping for air. My heart hammered in my chest, my skin covered in a thin layer of sweat despite the chill. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. The tracks were still there, leading up to my door. The cold air stung my skin as I stood there, outside my apartment, panting and trembling. I hadn't realized how badly my heart was pounding until I felt the sting of each breath cutting through my chest. I had to get away, to leave, but something inside me held me there, frozen at the threshold of the door. The open door behind me felt like a curse, like a gateway to something far worse. My mind kept cycling through the same thought: I can't go back in there. But the apartment was mine. I couldn't leave it behind. I couldn't just run from this. Whatever this was, it had followed me home. It had invaded the place where I should feel safest. I turned back toward the door, but the night outside felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold or the dark, it was that feeling, the same sense of being watched, like someone or something was standing just beyond my line of sight, waiting for me to look away. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, as though to reassure myself that I wasn't being followed, that I hadn't imagined everything. But the street was empty, silent. No one else around. I made a decision. I would go back inside. I had to face it. The moment my foot crossed the threshold again, the chill from outside seemed to dissipate, but something in the air was still different. The oppressive silence from earlier had returned. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped in slowly, warily, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. The tracks. They were still there, but they were different. Before, they had been small, almost unremarkable, but now they were larger, deeper, as though something heavier had been walking through the apartment. I followed them with my gaze, my eyes tracing the wet footprints from the entranceway, past the kitchen, all the way toward the hallway. The strange, decaying smell was stronger now, more suffocating. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the kitchen, the walls, or if it was something that had just seeped into the very air itself. But it was everywhere, thick and pungent, clinging to everything. I hesitated, standing at the doorway, my breath shallow. My fingers trembled as I reached for the light switch, the flick of the switch echoing in the stillness. The kitchen light flickered before illuminating the room in a harsh, buzzing glow. I scanned the room, heart hammering in my chest, but nothing moved. The air was thick with tension, but the room was empty. My eyes snapped to the hallway. The faint outline of the door to my bedroom was visible, and I noticed for the first time that the door, my bedroom door, was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that before. It had been firmly shut when I left. I forced myself to move, despite the ice in my veins, despite the knot in my stomach tightening with every step. I reached the door, and as I pushed it open, my eyes immediately locked on the floor. The tracks. They were inside my bedroom now. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The prints stretched across the floor, but they weren't just leading anywhere. They were leading to my bed. A sharp, cold breeze swept across my skin, sending a shiver through me. The room felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. I stepped forward cautiously, my feet making no sound as I approached the bed. The tracks grew clearer the closer I got, the dampness now almost overwhelming. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place, something subtle. The sheets. They were twisted and pulled tight around the bed frame, as though someone had been in my bed. No, as though something had been there. I reached down to touch the sheets, my hand trembling, but just as my fingers brushed the fabric, I froze. The bed wasn't empty. There was a shape under the blankets. At first, I couldn't see it clearly, just the distorted, big outline of something that didn't belong. But as I stared, the shape shifted. I could make out limbs, long, impossibly long limbs, stretching unnaturally beneath the covers. And then, there was a face. Not a face in any way I had ever seen before. The features were twisted, melted together into a grotesque, wrong mockery of a human face. The eyes were wide, too wide, hollow and dark, like something had hollowed them out and replaced them with nothing. The mouth, it was stretched too thin, jagged, like it had been torn open and sewn back together. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The thing under the blanket didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched. I stumbled backward, my legs buckling under the weight of my fear. I hit the wall behind me, gasping for air, the room spinning around me. No. No, no, no. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. I turned to run, but as I reached the doorway, the light flickered. The apartment felt smaller now, suffocating. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, almost as if the room itself was alive. And then I heard it. A soft, low sound, like a whisper from the depths of the earth. Come closer. The voice wasn't human. It was cold, hollow, like it came from somewhere beyond the limits of the world I knew. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The whisper filled my mind, louder now, echoing through my skull, reverberating off the walls. Come closer. I turned back toward the bed, my vision blurred by fear. The thing had moved. It was standing now. It was towering over the bed, impossibly tall, its twisted, elongated limbs reaching out toward me. The dark, hollow eyes locked onto mine, as though it could see straight through me. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, completely paralyzed. The thing was moving toward me, its limbs stretching out, its face growing clearer with each step. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Come closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing's fingers brushed against my cheek, cold as ice. Its touch burned. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The darkness pressed in from all sides. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Everything stopped. The figure froze in place, just a few inches from me, its mouth still open, its eyes still locked onto mine. It didn't speak again. It didn't have to. The room was still, unbearably still. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, staring at the thing before me. Its gaze, cold, relentless, held me in place, unable to look away, unable to breathe. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides, and I could feel the weight of the thing's presence like a physical force. I was trapped. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, but the figure didn't move. It just waited. The only sound was the dull thumping of my own heartbeat, hammering in my chest, drawing out everything else. Why? I tried to whisper, but the words caught in my throat, as though the very act of speaking might provoke it. I couldn't decide what was more terrifying, its silence, or the way it made me feel so small, so insignificant in its presence. I should have backed away, should have run. My instinct screamed at me to move, to escape. But I couldn't. My feet were frozen, glued to the spot. The thing's face, that terrible, twisted thing, remained locked on mine, its eyes unblinking. There was no hint of expression, no flicker of emotion, just an unrelenting, empty stare. Its mouth was open wide, but it didn't make a sound. Not a word. Not a breath. I shifted slightly, trying to make sense of it all. The smell was suffocating now, a mix of rot and decay that seemed to settle into my lungs, heavy and thick. But it wasn't just the smell. It was the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The room, my own apartment, no longer felt like home. It felt like a place that had been overtaken by something far worse, something far older. I glanced at the doorway, my only possible escape, but as I looked, I realized with rising horror that the tracks, those wet, damp footprints, had followed me in. They had appeared before, but now they were all over the apartment, snaking through the kitchen, along the walls, across the floors. Each print seemed to pulse, almost alive, as though the presence of the thing had left a mark that couldn't be erased. But it was worse than that. I could feel the pressure building, a heavy weight pressing down on me. My chest tightened, and my breathing became shallow, rapid. It wasn't just the thing, it was the room itself. The walls seemed to be closing in, pulling tighter, inching closer to me with every passing second. The air was suffocating, stifling. My lungs burned for oxygen, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the air itself was being sucked away. I turned back to the creature before me. Its face was now even closer, its eyes inches from mine, its breath like ice against my skin. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. The very presence of it seemed to drain me, paralyze me. It felt like my own mind was slipping, like I was being pulled into its dark void, sucked into the nothingness that seemed to emanate from it. "Why are you here?" My voice cracked, barely a whisper, but it felt louder than the silence surrounding us. The question was almost absurd. How could I expect an answer from something so otherworldly? The thing didn't reply. It didn't need to. Instead, it moved. Slowly. Almost methodically. Its limbs stretched, impossibly long and twisted, as it lurched toward me. Its fingers scraped across the floor, dragging a sound that chilled me to the bone, like nails on a blackboard. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The paralysis was complete. The thing was coming closer, its shape shifting, its limbs bending and cracking in ways that no human body should. I couldn't breathe. I could barely see. The darkness, the shadows, were starting to bleed together, turning the room into a blur. And then it spoke. Its voice was a hollow echo, coming from all directions at once. Not a whisper. Not a scream. But something in between. "You're not alone." The words slithered into my mind, creeping through my thoughts, twisting them, infecting them. I didn't understand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But still, I couldn't move. Not a single muscle in my body responded. It was as though I had become part of the room, part of the dark, suffocating presence that surrounded me. "You're not alone." The words rang in my ears, over and over again, louder now. And then, in a terrifying moment of clarity, I realized it wasn't talking to me. Something moved behind me. I dared not turn. I couldn't. It was worse than the creature before me. It was the thing that followed me. The presence that had been waiting for me. The thing that had been leaving the footprints. It wasn't alone either. I felt the shift in the air, the sensation of something cold and heavy brushing against my back, like a shadow that had taken form. And then, a pair of hands, icy and soft like death itself, reached out to grab me. I don't know how, but somehow, I moved. I pushed through the paralysis, pushed through the crushing weight in my chest. I bolted toward the door, my body jerking with every movement, as though the thing was pulling me back, trying to drag me into the dark. But I made it. I stumbled into the hallway, my hands scraping against the walls for support. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The thing, they were still there, still coming. I ran and didn't stop. But as I reached the end of the hall, as I threw myself toward the exit, I saw it. Another set of tracks. Wet. Damp. Right in front of the door. They weren't mine. And they led into the dark. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.